The last time anyone saw Rebecca Lange before she vanished, she was arranging popcorn in a blue ceramic bowl, the same bowl the family used every Friday night. It was March 14th, 2008, and the air through the half-open window carried that brittle cold particular to late winter in Ontario, when ice still clings to the edges of gutters, but the sun promises something softer. Rebecca wore turquoise sneakers, laces double-knotted the way she always did, and a grey hoodie pulled over her wrists. She'd babysat for the Calloway children, 7-year-old Liam and 4-year-old Sophie, dozens of times before, and the ritual was familiar. Animated movie, popcorn, bedtime stories, then homework at the kitchen table while the house settled into quiet. But by morning, Rebecca was gone, and those turquoise sneakers sat neatly by the front door, as if she'd stepped out of them mid-stride and kept walking into the dark. The Calloways had left her at 6:45 that evening, heading to a charity dinner across town. Rebecca had arrived 10 minutes early, backpack slung over one shoulder, smelling faintly of vanilla body spray. She'd waved at Mrs. Calloway from the driveway, her breath visible in the cold air. Liam had already picked the movie, something about talking animals, and Sophie clutched a stuffed rabbit she refused to sleep without. The house, a modest 2-story with yellow siding on the edge of a neighborhood, thick with maples and chain-link fences, felt warm against the chill outside. Rebecca locked the door behind the Calloways, flipped on the porch light, and turned toward the living room where the children were already sprawled on the carpet waiting. No one could say precisely when the evening tilted from routine into something else. What investigators would later reconstruct was this. Rebecca made popcorn around 7:15. She texted her best friend, Alyssa, at 7:30, a single line, "Liam's trying to explain the movie plot and it's hilarious," followed by a laughing emoji. At 8:05, a neighbor walking her dog noticed the Calloway house looked normal, lights on in the living room, curtains half drawn. By 8:20, Sophie was asleep on the couch, and Liam, yawning, had brushed his teeth and climbed into bed. Rebecca had tucked him in, left his door cracked, and turned off the hallway light. Then, sometime in the next 90 minutes, Rebecca Lange disappeared. If you've ever wondered how a person can vanish from a locked house in a quiet neighborhood, how a trusted routine can fracture into decades of questions, subscribe and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? When the Calloways returned at 10:30, the house was still. The porch light glowed, the front door was locked. Inside, everything looked untouched. Popcorn bowl rinsed and drying in the rack, television off, Rebecca's backpack open on the kitchen table, with her calculus textbook face down beside a half-finished worksheet. Her phone was there too, plugged into the wall charger, battery at 68%. Her coat hung on the hook by the door. But Rebecca was not there. Mrs. Calloway called up the stairs, assuming Rebecca had dozed off in the guest room, but the bed was made, pillows undisturbed. Mr. Calloway checked the children, both asleep, unharmed, exactly as they should be. He opened the back door and stepped into the yard, calling Rebecca's name into the cold. Silence. No footprints in the frost-thin grass, no sign she'd stepped outside at all. It was as if she'd evaporated. At 10:52, the Calloways dialed 911. By 11:15, 2 patrol officers were walking the property with flashlights, their beams slicing through the dark, catching the silver edges of trash cans, the rusted swing set, the wooden fence that bordered the alley. One officer noted the back door was unlocked, though Mr. Calloway couldn't remember if it had been that way when he'd checked. The latch was old, finicky. It didn't always catch unless you jiggled the knob. Rebecca's turquoise sneakers were side by side on the mat inside the front door, laces still tied. She'd been wearing socks, white ankle socks with a small yellow stripe, Mrs. Calloway remembered. But those were gone too. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. The house held its breath, Rebecca's parents, Tom and Diane Lange, arrived within the hour, faces grey with panic. Diane clutched a photo of her daughter, Rebecca smiling in her high school volleyball uniform, and handed it to the officer in charge. Tom kept asking the same question, his voice climbing. Where would she go without her shoes, without her phone? Why would she leave? No one had an answer. Rebecca was 17, a junior at Northview High, an honor roll student who babysat to save for college. She didn't drink, didn't use drugs, had no boyfriend, no recent arguments, no history of running away. Her life was woven tightly into routines. School, volleyball practice, Friday night babysitting, church on Sundays. The idea that she'd walked out of the Calloway house barefoot, without explanation, into a March night barely above freezing, made no sense. Yet that was the only story the evidence seemed to tell. By dawn, a search was underway. Neighbors gathered in clusters, clutching paper coffee cups and maps, hastily printed from the township office. The local fire department brought in tracking dogs, German shepherds trained to follow scent trails. They started in the Calloway backyard, noses low to the ground, handlers calling commands in calm, practiced voices. The dogs picked up Rebecca's scent near the back door, followed it down the driveway to the sidewalk, then circled twice and sat, indicating the trail ended. One handler, a man named Ray Booker, with 30 years of experience, said it usually meant the person got into a vehicle. But whose vehicle? And why would Rebecca leave willingly, without her shoes, without a word to anyone? Police canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a car idling, heard voices, noticed anything unusual between 8 and 10:30 the night before. Most had been inside, windows closed against the cold, television sets flickering. One man, Leo Garrett, who lived 3 houses down, mentioned he'd taken out the trash around 9 and thought he'd seen a dark sedan, maybe blue, maybe black, parked under the broken streetlight near the corner. He hadn't paid much attention. People parked there all the time. Another neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Colleen, said she'd heard a car door shut around 9:15, maybe 9:20, but again, it hadn't seemed strange. Doors shut all the time. This was a neighborhood where people came and went, where ambient noise blurred into background. The police issued a missing person alert. Rebecca's face appeared on the local news that evening, brown hair pulled into a ponytail, light brown eyes, a small scar near her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. The ticker at the bottom of the screen listed her height, 5'6", and what she'd been wearing, grey hoodie, jeans, white socks. The Langes sat beside the police spokesperson at a press conference, Diane gripping Tom's hand so hard her knuckles went white. "If anyone has seen our daughter," Diane said, voice breaking, "please, please call. She's just a kid. She couldn't finish. The room filled with the sound of camera shutters. Flyers went up on telephone poles, taped to shop windows, pinned to community boards at the library and the grocery store. Rebecca's smile beamed out from every corner. Missing since March 14th, last seen on Elm Street. The high school held a vigil. Students lit candles on the front lawn, their faces solemn in the wavering light. Alyssa, Rebecca's best friend, spoke through tears, describing Rebecca as loyal, funny, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and always texted back. "She wouldn't just leave," Alyssa said. "Something happened to her." The crowd murmured agreement, but what that something was remained a mystery wrapped in silence. In the first week, leads poured in. A woman in a neighboring county called to report seeing a girl matching Rebecca's description at a gas station. Police reviewed surveillance footage, wrong girl, wrong jacket. Another caller insisted Rebecca had been spotted boarding a Greyhound bus heading toward Ottawa. That, too, led nowhere. A man phoned in claiming he'd seen Rebecca with an older man in a diner, looking upset, but when detectives followed up, the timeline didn't match. Each lead was a small flame of hope that sputtered out, leaving the Langes and the Calloways in deeper darkness. Investigators turned their attention to Rebecca's life, searching for fractures, for secrets that might explain a sudden departure. They interviewed her teachers, her coach, her classmates. Everyone painted the same picture. Rebecca was steady, responsible, maybe a little reserved. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. She wanted to study veterinary medicine. She'd never mentioned feeling threatened, never hinted at trouble at home or school. Detectives examined her laptop, scrolling through emails and browser history. There were college websites, study guides, messages to Alyssa about weekend plans. Nothing alarming. Her social media accounts were sparse. Occasional photos of her dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a few group shots from volleyball tournaments. No suspicious contacts, no coded messages, no digital breadcrumbs leading anywhere. Tom and Diane opened their home to police. They handed over Rebecca's journals, her phone records, anything that might help. One detective, a woman named Linda Park, with a patient, gentle manner, read through Rebecca's diary entries. They were ordinary. Complaints about homework, excitement over a good grade, plans to visit her grandmother in the summer. On March 10th, 4 days before she disappeared, Rebecca had written, "Babysitting the Callaway Kids Friday." Liam's obsessed with that new movie. Sophie's finally sleeping through the night. Mrs. C said she'd pay extra if I stay late, so maybe I can finally get those new cleats. It was the entry of a teenager, thinking about the future, not someone planning to vanish. Still, the investigation expanded. Detectives looked into the Callaways themselves, standard procedure in cases involving a missing person last seen in someone's home. Both had solid alibis. The charity dinner was well attended, and dozens of people confirmed the couple had been there from 7 until 10:15. Their phones pinged cell towers across town, corroborating their story. Liam and Sophie were too young to provide detailed accounts, but child psychologists interviewed them gently. Liam remembered Rebecca tucking him in, remembered her saying goodnight. Sophie remembered the movie, the popcorn, Rebecca's voice reading a bedtime story about a bunny who got lost in the woods. Neither child recalled hearing the doorbell, hearing voices, hearing anything out of the ordinary. If someone had come to the house, they'd done so quietly. Weeks bled into months. The initial surge of volunteers dwindled. Search parties grew smaller, less frequent. The police assigned the case to a detective named Paul Gerard, a man in his early 50s with silver-threaded hair and a reputation for dogged persistence. Gerard re-interviewed everyone, re-walked the neighborhood, re-examined the evidence. He brought in a forensic team to process the Callaway house again. They dusted for prints, swabbed surfaces, vacuumed for trace evidence. Nothing conclusive emerged. A few partial prints belonged to family members or Rebecca herself. A strand of hair caught in the back door frame was tested and matched Rebecca, but it told them nothing they didn't already know. By summer, the case had gone cold. The media moved on to other stories. The flyers faded in the sun, ink bleeding into pale ghosts of Rebecca's face. The Langes hired a private investigator, a former cop named Howard Klein, who'd worked missing persons cases for 2 decades. Klein approached it methodically, re-interviewed neighbors, scoured databases for Jane Does matching Rebecca's description, cross-referenced missing persons reports across Ontario and beyond. He found nothing. It was, he admitted to the Langes over coffee one grey afternoon, as if Rebecca had stepped into a void. Tom and Diane's marriage frayed under the weight of not knowing. Tom threw himself into searching, spending hours online, in missing persons forums, messaging psychics, following up on tips that police had already dismissed. Diane withdrew, unable to sleep in Rebecca's room, but unable to change it either. Rebecca's bed stayed made, her volleyball trophies lined up on the shelf, her turquoise sneakers moved from the Callaway house back to the Langes, placed in the closet like relics. They celebrated Rebecca's 18th birthday without her, a cake with unlit candles sitting on the kitchen table. Diane cried until she couldn't breathe, and Tom held her, both of them drowning in absence. The first anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance came and went. The local news ran a brief segment, still missing 1 year later. But it felt perfunctory. The Callaways sent flowers to the Langers, along with a card expressing sorrow and helplessness. Liam, now 8, asked his mother once if Rebecca would ever come back. Mrs. Callaway didn't know how to answer. The truth was too uncertain, too painful. "I hope so, sweetheart," she'd said, and left it at that. Detective Gerard kept the file open, reviewing it every few months, hoping something new would surface. In late 2009, a database called the National DNA Databank began expanding its missing persons profiles. Gerard submitted Rebecca's DNA, obtained from a hairbrush the Langers had kept. It was a long shot, but if Rebecca's remains were ever found and entered into the system, it could trigger a match. For now, though, there was nothing to match against. Years passed. The Langes aged visibly, grief etching lines into their faces. Tom took early retirement. Diane reduced her hours at the bookstore where she worked. They attended support groups for families of the missing, sitting in fluorescent-lit church basements, listening to others describe the same unbearable limbo. Some families had answers eventually. Bodies found, cases closed. Others, like the Langers, existed in perpetual suspension, unable to mourn, unable to move forward. Rebecca was everywhere and nowhere, in the way light slanted through the kitchen window, in the sound of a volleyball game on TV, in the turquoise sneakers Diane still couldn't bring herself to throw away. In 2011, a tip came in that briefly reignited hope. A woman in Alberta called police, claiming she'd seen a young woman resembling Rebecca working at a grocery store in a small town near Edmonton. The woman had seemed nervous, avoided eye contact, and the caller thought it might be her. Alberta authorities investigated. They located the woman, who turned out to be 24, not 20, and had lived in the area her entire life. Another dead end. Then in the spring of 2012, 4 years and 1 month after Rebecca disappeared, something happened that cracked the case open in a way no one had anticipated. Alyssa, Rebecca's best friend, had graduated from college and moved to Toronto to start a marketing job. On a Saturday in April, she was walking through Kensington Market, a neighborhood thick with vintage shops and food stalls, the air smelling of fresh bread and incense. She stopped to buy a coffee, and as she waited for her change, she glanced across the street and froze. There, standing in front of a second-hand bookstore, holding the hand of a toddler with dark curls, was Rebecca. Alyssa's first instinct was disbelief. 4 years had passed. People changed. Maybe it was someone who looked like Rebecca. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became. The shape of the face, the way she tilted her head when she spoke to the child, the small scar near her eyebrow. It was her. Alyssa's hands shook as she crossed the street, weaving between parked cars, her heart hammering. "Rebecca!" she called out, her voice thin and unsure. The woman turned, and for a split second their eyes met. Recognition flickered, brief, unmistakable, and then the woman's expression shuttered. She scooped up the toddler, turned, and walked quickly in the opposite direction. Alyssa ran after her, calling her name, but Rebecca disappeared into the crowd. Alyssa stood on the sidewalk, shaking, trying to catch her breath. She pulled out her phone and called the police, her words tumbling over each other. "I just saw Rebecca Lange. I know it sounds crazy, but it was her. She's here in Toronto with a little kid. You have to—" The operator took down the details, location, description, and assured her someone would follow up. Alyssa then called Diane Lange, barely coherent. "I saw her," Alyssa said. "I saw Rebecca. She's alive." Diane thought she'd misheard. "What? Where?" Alyssa explained again, and Diane felt the room tilt. 4 years of grief, of imagining the worst, and now this. Rebecca was alive, walking around Toronto with a child. The relief was immediate and enormous, but it was chased almost instantly by confusion. Why hadn't Rebecca come home? Why had she run when Alyssa called her name? Toronto police opened an investigation based on Alyssa's report. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby businesses, looking for anyone matching Rebecca's description. It took 2 days, but they found her. A grainy shot of a young woman with light brown hair, holding a toddler, entering a small apartment building on a side street in Parkdale. Detectives traced the building's rental records. The apartment was leased under the name Laura Finch, a name that meant nothing to investigators until they ran it through databases and found no prior history, no driver's license, no credit cards, no employment records before 2009. It was, as one detective noted, a ghost identity. Officers visited the building, knocked on the door of the apartment. A young woman answered, a toddler on her hip. She looked tired, wary, and when they asked if her name was Rebecca Lange, she hesitated just long enough for them to know. "I'm Laura," she said quietly. "I think you have the wrong person." But her hands were trembling, and the officers could see it. They asked if they could come in, and after a long pause she stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was small, sparsely furnished. A couch with a faded blanket, a second-hand crib in the corner, a bookshelf sagging under the weight of children's picture books. The toddler, a little girl with dark curls and serious brown eyes, clung to Rebecca's leg, watching the strangers with suspicion. One of the officers, a woman named Officer Janet Brooks, crouched down to the child's level and smiled gently. "Hi there. What's your name?" The little girl didn't answer, just buried her face in Rebecca's jeans. Detective Gerard was notified immediately and made the 2-hour drive from Ontario. When he arrived at the apartment, Rebecca, Laura, was sitting on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. Gerard introduced himself, spoke softly, letting the silence settle before he asked the question everyone needed answered. "Are you Rebecca Lange?" She closed her eyes, nodded. The relief that flooded through Gerard was profound, but it was complicated by the next question. Why? Why had she left? And why had she stayed gone for 4 years? Rebecca's answer came slowly, in fragments, as if each word cost her something. She'd left the Callaway house that night, she said, because she was scared. She didn't offer details at first, and Gerard didn't push. He knew from experience that trauma had its own timeline, its own language. What mattered, in that moment, was that she was alive and that she was sitting in front of him. Over the next several hours, Rebecca told her story. It began, she said, not on the night she disappeared, but months earlier. She'd been receiving messages, anonymous texts and emails that started out vaguely unsettling and escalated into something darker. Someone knew where she went to school, where she babysat, what route she walked home. The messages weren't explicitly threatening at first, but they carried an undertone of surveillance, of being watched. Rebecca hadn't told her parents or the police because she thought she was overreacting, that it was a classmate playing a cruel prank. She'd blocked numbers, deleted emails, tried to ignore it, but the night of March 14th, something changed. Around 8:45, while the Callaway children were asleep, Rebecca received a call on the Callaway landline, an old rotary phone Mrs. Callaway kept plugged in for emergencies. The voice on the other end was low, distorted, and it said her full name. It said, "I'm outside." Rebecca's blood went cold. She hung up, checked the locks, turned off the lights in the living room, and stood in the hallway, listening. Then she heard it, the back door handle rattling. She didn't scream. She didn't call 911. She was 17, terrified, and convinced that if she called the police, whoever was outside would hurt the children. So she made a choice that in hindsight seemed impossible to explain. She unlocked the back door, slipped off her shoes so she wouldn't make noise, and stepped outside. She'd expected to find someone there, expected confrontation. Instead, the yard was empty, the alley beyond it dark and quiet. She stood there, socks soaking through on the cold concrete, and then she heard a car engine start nearby. A dark sedan pulled up to the mouth of the alley, headlights off. The driver's window rolled down, and a man's voice, calmer now without the distortion, said, "Get in or I go back inside." Rebecca believed him. She got in the car. What followed was 4 years of coercion, control, and psychological manipulation that Rebecca struggled to articulate. The man, whose identity she would later help authorities uncover, took her to a house on the outskirts of a small town she didn't recognize. He told her that if she tried to leave, if she contacted anyone, he'd hurt her family. He took her phone, her ID, anything that connected her to her old life. For the first several months, she was kept isolated, rarely allowed outside. Gradually, as she stopped resisting, he loosened his grip, allowed her supervised errands, gave her small freedoms under the guise of trust. He told her she was safer with him, that the world outside was dangerous, that her family had stopped looking. He showed her news clippings from the early days of her disappearance, then pointed out when the coverage stopped, when the searches ended. "See," he'd said, "they moved on." Rebecca had tried in the first year to find a way out, but he monitored everything. Her movements, her conversations, the few times she was allowed to speak to neighbors. He was careful, methodical, and he made her believe that escape was impossible. Then, in 2010, she discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy was not consensual, not wanted, but it became the pivot point of her survival. The man, whose control had always been absolute, softened slightly when the baby arrived. A girl Rebecca named Lily, after her grandmother. Lily became Rebecca's reason to endure, and eventually her reason to hope. By 2011, the man had grown complacent. He allowed Rebecca to take Lily to a nearby park, to shop for groceries, to exist in small pockets of autonomy. Rebecca began planning. She saved money, coins, small bills, hidden in the lining of Lily's diaper bag. She memorized bus routes, learned where the nearest police station was. And in early 2012, when the man left for work one morning, Rebecca dressed Lily, grabbed the diaper bag, and walked out. She didn't run. She walked calmly to the bus stop, rode 2 hours to Toronto, and checked into a women's shelter under a false name. From there, she rented the apartment in Parkdale, found part-time work cleaning offices at night, and tried to build a life where she and Lily could be invisible. She hadn't contacted her parents because she was terrified the man would find out, would make good on his threats. She hadn't gone to the police because she didn't trust that the system could protect her or Lily. She'd convinced herself that staying hidden was the only way to keep her daughter safe. Seeing Alyssa had shattered that illusion, forced her to confront the impossibility of disappearing forever. Detective Gerard listened to Rebecca's account with a mix of relief and rage. He assured her that she was safe now, that they would find the man, that she and Lily would be protected. Rebecca gave them everything she could remember: the house's location, the man's name, David Kramer, a maintenance supervisor at a community center where Rebecca had once volunteered, and details about his vehicle, his habits, his threats. Within 48 hours, Ontario Provincial Police arrested Kramer at his home. They found Rebecca's original ID, her phone, and a file folder full of printed surveillance photos of Rebecca from before she disappeared, pictures of her leaving school, babysitting, walking her dog. It was a meticulous record of obsession. Kramer was charged with kidnapping, forcible confinement, sexual assault, and criminal harassment. The case would take months to build, and the legal process would be grueling. But for the first time in 4 years, Rebecca had allies, and she had the truth on her side. The Langes were contacted the same day Rebecca confirmed her identity. Diane collapsed when she heard, sobbing so hard Tom thought she'd stop breathing. They drove to Toronto immediately, still in disbelief, still terrified it was a mistake. When they walked into the small apartment and saw Rebecca sitting on the couch, Lily on her lap, time seemed to fold in on itself. Diane crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her daughter into her arms, and Rebecca broke. She cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in 4 years, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Tom stood behind them, one hand on Rebecca's shoulder, the other covering his mouth, trying not to fall apart. "We thought you were gone," he whispered. "We thought we'd lost you." Lily watched the adults with wide, uncertain eyes. She didn't know these people, didn't understand why her mother was crying, why strangers were holding her. Rebecca pulled back, wiped her face, and gently introduced her parents. "Lily, these are my mom and dad, your grandparents." Diane knelt down, tears streaming, and offered her hand. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's so good to meet you." Lily hesitated, then placed her small hand in Diane's, and something in Diane's chest that had been clenched tight for 4 years finally loosened. The reunification process was slow and complicated. Rebecca had been through profound trauma, and reintegration into her old life wasn't as simple as picking up where she'd left off. She agreed to work with a trauma therapist, someone who specialized in cases of prolonged captivity and coercive control. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, explained that Rebecca's responses, the decision to get in the car, the years spent complying, the fear of reaching out, were survival mechanisms, not failures. She helped Rebecca understand that she had done what she needed to do to stay alive and to protect Lily. Rebecca's physical health was assessed. She was underweight, anemic, had untreated dental issues from years without regular care. Lily, thankfully, was healthy, though she'd never seen a pediatrician. Both were enrolled in medical care, and slowly, with support, they began to stabilize. The Langes offered their home, but Rebecca wasn't ready to return to the place where she'd grown up. Too much had changed. Instead, they helped her find a small house in a quiet neighborhood outside the city, close enough that Diane and Tom could visit regularly, far enough that Rebecca had space to breathe. The legal proceedings against Kramer unfolded over the next year. Rebecca testified, her voice steady despite the weight of reliving those years. Kramer showed no remorse, insisting he'd cared for her, that she'd stayed because she wanted to. The jury didn't buy it. In 2013, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 22 years in prison. The judge, in her remarks, commended Rebecca's courage and noted the importance of recognizing coercive control as a form of violence that doesn't always leave visible scars. The Calloways reached out to Rebecca after the trial, tentative and apologetic. They'd carried guilt for 4 years, wondering if they'd missed something, if they could have prevented what happened. Rebecca met with them once, in a neutral space with her therapist present. She told them it wasn't their fault, that Kramer had been planning this long before that night, and that she didn't blame them. Liam and Sophie, now 11 and 8, didn't remember much, but they drew pictures for Rebecca and Lily, bright, messy crayon drawings of flowers and butterflies. Rebecca pinned them to Lily's bedroom wall. Rebecca eventually enrolled in online courses, working toward the degree she'd put on hold. She wanted to study social work, she said, to help others navigate systems that often fail people in crisis. It was slow going, balancing classes with parenting and therapy, but it gave her purpose beyond survival. Lily started preschool, a shy, quiet child who clung to Rebecca's hand on the first day and cried when Rebecca tried to leave. But with time, Lily adjusted, made friends, began to trust the world a little more. In 2014, the Langes and Rebecca collaborated with a local non-profit to establish a fund supporting families of missing persons and survivors of abduction. They called it the Turquoise Project, named for the sneakers Rebecca had left behind. The fund provided financial assistance for searches, therapy, legal fees, practical help for people caught in the same nightmare the Langes had endured. Diane became the fund's director, channeling her grief into action. At the fund's launch event, Rebecca spoke publicly for the first time, standing at a podium with Lily in the front row, coloring quietly. "I was missing for 4 years," Rebecca said, "but I was never gone. I was someone's daughter, someone's friend, and eventually someone's mother. I survived because I had to, and because somewhere people still believed I'd come home. If this fund helps even one family hold on to hope, it's worth it." The turquoise sneakers, still neatly laced, still holding the shape of Rebecca's feet, were kept in a glass case at the fund's office, a symbol of absence and return, of the objects that outlast us and the stories they carry. Visitors often stopped in front of the case, reading the plaque that explained their significance, and some cried, some nodded quietly, some simply stood there, taking it in. Rebecca and Lily's story didn't end with a neat bow. Trauma doesn't work that way. There were hard days. Days when Rebecca couldn't get out of bed, when the sound of a car door closing sent her into a panic, when Lily asked questions about her father that Rebecca didn't know how to answer. But there were good days too. Days when Lily laughed so hard she snorted, when Rebecca finished an essay she was proud of, when Diane brought over homemade lasagna and they ate dinner together, 3 generations around a table, safe and whole. In 2016, Rebecca earned her degree. She framed the diploma and hung it in the hallway next to a photo of Lily on her first day of kindergarten. She took a job at a crisis center, answering calls from people in situations she understood intimately. She was good at it, patient, calm, never judgmental. She knew how to listen for what wasn't being said, how to offer help without pressure. Her co-workers didn't know her story at first, and she didn't share it unless it was relevant. But eventually, word spread, and people began to understand the depth of resilience sitting at the desk by the window. Lily grew up knowing some version of the truth. Not all the details, not the full weight of it, but enough. She knew her mom had been through something hard and had survived. She knew her grandparents loved her fiercely. She knew the turquoise sneakers in the glass case represented something important. When she was 9, she asked Rebecca, "Do you wish things had been different?" Rebecca thought about it for a long time. "Yes," she said finally, "but if things had been different, I wouldn't have you. So it's complicated." Lily nodded, seeming to understand in the way children sometimes do, absorbing complexity without needing all the answers. The man who had taken Rebecca appealed his sentence twice. Both appeals were denied. He remains incarcerated, and Rebecca has no contact with him. She testified at his parole hearings, a brief statement reminding the board of what he took from her: 4 years, her sense of safety, her ability to trust easily. The board has denied parole both times. The Calloway family stayed in touch, sending holiday cards, occasional updates. Liam, now in high school, told Rebecca once that he used to have nightmares about the night she disappeared, that he thought it was his fault somehow for falling asleep. Rebecca hugged him and told him it was never his fault, that he'd been a kid doing exactly what kids do. He seemed lighter after that, as if he'd been carrying a weight he could finally set down. The Turquoise Project expanded over the years, partnering with law enforcement agencies to improve missing persons protocols, advocating for better resources for survivors of abduction, and funding community education programs on coercive control and domestic violence. It became, in many ways, Rebecca's second purpose, a way to transform the worst years of her life into something that helped others. Rebecca never moved back into her childhood bedroom. It remained mostly as she'd left it: volleyball trophies, posters on the wall, textbooks on the shelf. But it felt like a museum of a different person. She visited often, though, and sometimes she'd stand in the doorway and remember the 17-year-old girl who'd babysat to save for college. who'd double-knotted her turquoise sneakers, who'd thought the future was predictable. That girl was gone, in some ways. But she was also still here, folded into the woman Rebecca had become. Years after her return, Rebecca was invited to speak at a conference on trauma and resilience. She stood at a podium in front of hundreds of people and told her story. Not all of it, not the parts that were too raw, but enough. She talked about survival, about the systems that fail and the people who don't, about the small acts of courage that look like compliance but are, in fact, strategies for staying alive. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment, and then the applause came, warm and sustained. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her, to thank her, to share their own stories. Rebecca listened to each one, patient and present, offering the same grace she'd been given. The turquoise sneakers, still displayed at the Turquoise Project's office, became a symbol beyond Rebecca's story. Other families donated objects connected to their missing loved ones, a watch, a scarf, a baseball cap, each tagged with a name and a date, each representing a life interrupted and, in some cases, a life reclaimed. The display grew into a wall of memory and hope, a reminder that people are more than the worst things that happen to them, that absence can sometimes be followed by return, and that even in the darkest silences, someone is listening, someone is searching, someone is waiting for the door to open and the missing to come home.